because I'm a potato.
Hello world. Look at all that. We're on the edge of town, 100 blocks away.
Is Transistor worth getting? That's the question that we're going to try and answer during this video accompaniment to review, where I'm Peter. I will be chatting to Teflon about the game. So Tef, first of all, let's find out who it's by. It's from a studio called Supergiant. So who are they and what have they done?
Yeah, so Supergiant Games, they're an indie developer, and they shot to fame in 2011 with a game called Bastion, which I'm sure that many of you know from the Xbox 360 release. But it's a game that criminally didn't go, well, I say criminally, it's not exactly a criminal act, but they didn't get a release on PlayStation 3, which I find strange. So it's strange then that their second game, Transistor, which is out this week, is actually a PlayStation 4 exclusive.
Fancy. So the Bastion was the game. It was like an RPG, but it had a really sort of nice, hand-painted almost art style, and famous for the narrator that talked all the way through. Yeah,
and it was that narrator which was kind of the hook, which got a lot of people interested in the game. But at the same time, it was also a really very well done action RPG. It had very solid gameplay, and it also had as you mentioned, the art style and the gameplay mechanic of having the ground come up underneath your feet as you walk out into the abyss almost. So there was that to it. But the Transistor is a very different project. The setting is completely different. You now have a cyberpunk aesthetic with Art Deco elements in the design, and that is really beautifully done. But it does have some similarities back to Bastion. So it's still an action RPG. You've still got Jason Cunningham doing voices. He was the narrator in Bastion, and he's now the voice of the eponymous giant sword, the Transistor, which is kind of like a big green printed circuit board as well. So it's got those similarities, but it does also, in the gameplay, but it does also mix things up quite a lot.
So this isn't a direct sequel, it's more sort of a building on the style of Bastion.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what they've done is they've taken what worked well in Bastion, they've added ideas on top of that. So you've still got that voice, you've still got certain elements to the design and stuff, but when it comes to the gameplay, the biggest change is with the new planning phase. Now, there's lots of pseudo-programming language. So you've got the Transistor, which looks like a printed circuit board. You've got your abilities are called functions, but the biggest gameplay change is called turn, which is open bracket then close bracket, which is kind of a little running theme in the game.
It looks like programming language.
Yeah, exactly. And what it does is it lets you freeze time completely. You get to set out your moves and attacks that you want to make, and when you then want to trigger those, they all happen within just a few seconds, but in game time it happens within about half a second. So you've got no retaliation at that point, and you get your attacks in. The downside to doing this is then that you've got to wait for turn to cool down. So, and during that point, which is maybe, I think, up to 10 seconds sometimes, you've got to avoid attacks. You can't dish out any damage of your own unless you've got a special ability, blah, blah, blah. But I think that is a really clever way of managing things. I mean, you've still got the ability to play in real time, and sometimes that's even a better option. But then you also have the option to use turn, freeze time, get your attacks in, and that's just a very clever balance that they've struck.
Yeah, that makes it sound like it would be sort of easier for people who aren't used to quick reflexes games to get into, and to get be able to still compete on the same kind of level as somebody that is very used to playing video games.
Yeah, and I mean, what it really does is it makes each battle a bit more tactical, I guess, where you can think out every single move and look at the big picture, and then once your flurry of attacks has hit, then all you've got to do is you've got to worry about dodging the incoming attacks for the next few seconds. But there are a lot of other tweaks which do also make it really quite accessible. So, for example, the health system. The Transistor is allowed to have 4 of these functions active at any one time, and your health bar isn't actually for Red, who's the protagonist, but is for like one of these functions to get overloaded. So, in effect, you've got 4 health bars in a battle. Now, if you do take too much damage, what this means is that you have one of these functions locked off. You can't use it for the rest of that battle, you can't use it until you get to the next save terminal area. And that means that, yes, you're at a handicap for the rest of that battle, but you've also got a bit of a lifeline. You can tackle things in a different way, you know what you've got to do in order to get out of the situation. But then on the other side of things, you don't want it to be too easy. I mean, for the more advanced players, they're going to want some challenge to it, and so they've built in a system of handicaps for those people to turn on if they want them, and in exchange for a little XP boost, then you can give the process a bit more of an advantage, make them more challenging and difficult to deal with. So, for example, they might deal double damage at its simplest level, or a more complex one would be that during normal battles, when a process is killed, it will drop a cell which will respawn into the same process if you give it time. If you pick it up, then it won't respawn. So you'll have limiters which will have the process spitting out multiple cells. If you don't pick up either of them, you've literally doubled the number of enemies that you've got to deal with. Or they've got shields, or they are corrupted cells and they actually deal damage to you, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of optional difficulty which can actually become really, really important when you go up against the more difficult enemies later on in the game.
So would you say it kind of eases you into the way you have to go about things? So it sounds like it sort of gives you plenty of opportunity to make the odd mistake as you're learning how it works, but then becomes sort of a slightly trickier further on, so you kind of have to learn its systems then.
Yeah, because the process, I mean, they come in several different forms. So you have one which is kind of like a dog whose bark is worse than its bite because it's always barking at you and stunning you and stuff like that. That's a really annoying one, actually. You've got like a kind of paparazzi camera which floats after you and tries to block your views and distract you, that kind of thing. And as you come into a battle, every once in a while, you will pull the turn trigger and it will then display like the upgrade, because these enemies are evolving as you're playing the game as well. It will show the upgrade that they have got, and then you have to figure out, oh, okay, so that's that much harder, it can do this particular thing now, and this is what I need to do in order to tackle it.
And so then what about the RPG sort of elements? Is that, do you kind of build on your skills? Are there other skill trees, or how does that work?
So it all comes together in the Transistor itself. You'll come to a terminal pretty regularly, almost after or before almost every single battle, and here you can then switch your loadout. You have 4 slots for primary functions, and these are on your face buttons on the DualShock 4, and then each of these slots has got 2 potential secondary slots. Additionally, there's up to 4 passive slots, and you can mix and match your functions however you want. You've got these 14 functions across the whole game which you unlock, and you might decide that you want to take your most powerful attack and use it to augment a different one which shoots 3 shots, for example, or that same powerful attack will maybe make you more resistant to incoming fire, that kind of thing. So it's a very flexible system, and you can literally bend it to pretty much however you want to play the game at all.
So then, what about the story of it? If it's kind of building like that, do you gain the extras kind of abilities as the story progresses, or is it like a time thing? Is it like an XP based thing?
Well, it's a mixture of both. I mean, the story starts off right in the middle of a key plot point. You've got Red, who's the protagonist, and she is just stood over the body of this guy who has the big transistor sticking out of his chest.
And the transistor's like a huge sword, isn't it? It's like a... Yeah.
That's it. It's basically a great big sword which is made to look like a PCB. And you don't really know what's going on at this point. the Transistor starts talking to Red, telling her to escape, and you start moving on. You go through the first few battles, you maybe level up once or twice even, but then it's the first powers that you get are the first new functions that you get come along when you find bodies on the floor, and it's sort of like the Transistor is able to suck up their soul, or I guess it'd be a digital imprint and store
like flash memory stored on this PCB.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, that's quite cool.
Yeah, and once you've got the first few of these abilities, I think once you've got the first 4, so you've got all of your slots maxed out, then it starts to turn to the traditional RPG progression. So you gain experience from fighting battles, and then as you level up, you get to pick between a set of functions, a set of limiters, and like opening up extra slots or earning more points for the functions that you can choose. But the functions themselves all have a kind of little backstory to them. They're all a different person, a different digital imprint, and as you use them in different ways, you unlock their backstory. And it ties into the overall plot of the game, which I don't really want to spoil too much about the story, but the Camerata, who are a group which created the process, they're out to get Red, basically, and they've already stolen her voice. And so now it's basically a story of her trying to survive and fight back against them.
See, that sort of plays into something else that you said. You said that it has like a revenge feeling to it, and that makes it sound like it might be quite sort of gruesome, but it definitely looks more like it's very whimsical. And things you've said like privately before about just tell us what the L1 button does.
Okay, so she might not be able to speak, but Red can still hum, and what this does in the game is you've got Darren Korb's brilliant soundtrack. His work was, again, one of the most popular things on Bastion, and he's back, and he's created another fantastic soundtrack, and holding the L1 button gets Red to hum along with the backing. And
which is brilliant.
It is brilliant, and sort of like a spotlight comes down from heaven, and it's beautiful, and like her voice, well, her humming is done by Ashley Barrett, who was also on, I think she was only on one track from the Bastion soundtrack, but what she has done is just beautiful, and it's so utterly, I guess, soulful is the way that I describe it. The way because then in the game, like, she's clutching the transistor, the beam of light comes down, and she's just humming along. And these are some really lovely compositions as well. And I found that basically every time I got to a new area, I was stopping and listening to the background music, and then holding the L1 button so I could hear her hum and add this extra layer on top of it. And
I think that sounds really cool when you're talking about like a revenge story and like an RPG, somebody building their skills and all this like combat going on. I think it's really nice that it still has that feeling of whimsy, and that kind of ties into the look of it as well, I think.
Yeah, it ties into the look, it ties into how much time you can take during combat. And I mean, the combat isn't gruesome. You're basically going up against like viruses in the system, that kind of thing, which have been turned into a physical form. And yeah, just being able to just stop, sit back, close your eyes and listen to her hum is basically, it's just gorgeous.
So, all things considered then, I think we probably know the answer to this, but do you think that people should be paying attention to Transistor this week?
Nah, not really. No. Absolutely. I mean, As I said at the start, Bastion didn't make its way to the PlayStation 3, but it still has, for Supergiant Games as a company, there's still a lot of goodwill and a lot of knowledge about what they did with Bastion. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that was a fan of Bastion just how well this game has come out. And if you're not familiar with it, if you just want an action RPG, if you just want something that's really very, very pretty to look at, then yeah, definitely have a look at Transistor.